What do you get when a franchise as beloved for its horror as its comedy is given new life with one of the most gruesome horror movies of all time? In 2013, the Evil Dead franchise, dormant since 1992's Army of Darkness but kept alive by fans waiting for a new film for 2 decades, rose from the grave with Evil Dead. But instead of having director Sam Raimi at the helm, or star Bruce Campbell back as Ash, this Evil Dead was a reset. Not quite a remake, not quite a reboot, not quite a sequel, but a return to the grueling terror of the 1981 original that Raimi and friends created to break into Hollywood. Evil Dead was produced by Raimi, Campbell, and Rob Tappert, but directed by Fede Alvarez and written by Alvarez and Rodo Sayagüez. And instead of centering on the further adventures of Ash Williams' fight against the forces of the Necronomicon, this new film takes us back to that old cabin in the woods for a new set of characters who find the Book of the Dead and are possessed and killed one by one. Alvarez's Evil Dead is both a hard shift for the franchise and a return to its roots. But without a sequel and Ash returning in both a TV show and countless spin-offs in other media, it's an outlier in a beloved franchise. But is that a bad thing? Let's explore the history behind the Evil Dead reboot, its approach to horror that reflects both Raimi and Alvarez's outlooks on the genre, and how this return to the cabin became the true fulfillment of Raimi and friends' original desire to create the ultimate experience in grueling terror. Sam Raimi's The Evil Dead is one of the all-time great success stories of a group of friends putting all of their talent and passion into a micro-budget film and using it to break into Hollywood. As I covered in my video on the Evil Dead trilogy a few years ago, Raimi, Campbell, Tappert, and a small group of actors and crew members raised enough financing from local Michigan businesses to shoot their film, originally titled Book of the Dead, in a cabin over many arduous months of production. But when the film debuted as The Evil Dead, it became a mini sensation. I won't go into all the details here, but by the time Army of Darkness hit theaters to underwhelming numbers, Raimi and crew were ready to move on from Ash's story. But fans weren't. Afterward, the franchise lived on in hundreds of comics bearing the Evil Dead, Ash, and Army of Darkness branding, and a lot of video games of varying quality. But fans still waited for more Evil Dead on the big screen. After a few years of rumors and rumblings, a new Evil Dead was officially announced in 2011, confirming Campbell's earlier discussions of it being a remake and not a continuation. Evil Dead sees a group of friends travel to a remote cabin in the woods to help Mia, played by Jane Levy, overcome her heroin addiction by going cold turkey, with her estranged brother David, Shiloh Fernandez, trying to reconnect with his sister after years of family trauma. Of course, there's also a copy of Naturam de Monto,
roughly translated, Book of the Dead,
in the cabin. And when overly curious dummy Eric reads from the book, an evil force is summoned and possesses Mia.
Honda.
Although featuring a brand new set of characters and making some tweaks here and there, this 2013 film is very much a remake of the original, even if it doesn't replace it in series canon and can coexist with the rest of the franchise due to its vague allusions to other films.
One by one we will take you.
In some ways, Alvarez's reboot is almost a reclamation project for Raimi's original. Not that I think the original Evil Dead is in any need of reclamation, but I find that to be the underlying idea behind this film. The Evil Dead was created as a pure horror film, with its grisly deaths and shocking twists helping it to become a hit. But its extremely limited budget and rough production are obvious when watching. Those elements, combined with Raimi's massive talent behind the camera, make it special. But it's clear that Raimi and company saw plenty of room for improvement on their original creation. As a whole, the Evil Dead series has been defined by Evil Dead 2 and Army of Darkness, and not the original. The comics, video games, and Ash vs. Evil Dead have followed in the footsteps of extreme blood and gore counterbalanced by a focus on comedy, all seen through a hyperkinetic lens. It also doesn't hurt that Evil Dead 2 basically redoes the original in its first 15 minutes, due to Raimi and company not having the rights to use footage in their sequel. Viewers can essentially start the franchise with any film and not be lost. But with so much of the series defined by Raimi wanting to make audiences laugh at his splatstick approach approach to flesh-ripping terror, and Bruce Campbell turning Ash into a cocky but deadly buffoon, the original scares of The Evil Dead feel more like a dry run for what was to come. And honestly, the fast, intense, in-your-face, bloody laughs of Evil Dead 2, the greatest movie of all time, right above Predator and Kiki's Delivery Service, are what made me a fan of the franchise. Especially when I first saw these films when I was like 12. And the original scared the hell out of me. So it's with this outlook on the franchise that I first watched Alvarez's new approach to Evil Dead. And while I knew this would be a darker, more serious interpretation of the series, I didn't quite click with this intense, mean, gruesome approach. Of course, the woman that brought her screaming, terrified 3-year-old son to the theater didn't help either. Shout out to that lady. I'm sure he had a day he never forgot. And I don't think I'm alone in not quite getting on the wavelength of 2013's Evil Dead either. The franchise had existed for decades in its more Looney Tunes-esque mode. So a new movie done directly in the style of the original was a big change in direction. Still, Fede Alvarez's approach is very much in the spirit of the original Evil Dead, and it's claimed to be the ultimate experience in grueling terror. Evil Dead was Alvarez's first feature, with Raimi and his production company Ghost House Pictures using the remake to help give the Uruguayan his big break like the original did for himself. Actually, Alvarez was a longtime Evil Dead fan whose story mirrors my own. We spent a lot of time asking what Evil Dead meant to us. I watched Evil Dead when I was 12. I was going through all the horror I could grab. I remember going to the video store and asking for something real, and the guy gave me the Evil Dead VHS. When you're 12, you're not supposed to see that. I knew I wasn't supposed to do this, but I did it anyway. I went home, my parents weren't around, and it was a very, very, very bad call. I shouldn't have watched that movie. I was 12, too young. I was traumatized by it. It was a super violent and scary movie. Coming back to now, with my friend writing the script, we thought, that's what we have to do now. Keep what we really remember. Then the last time I saw it was about 6 years ago. I didn't want to rewatch it. I wanted to remember the key ideas, what has stayed with me all this time. So that's what we put in the new one. Basically, what we pitched to Raimi was, let's try to make the scariest movie ever. Something that is gross. Something you feel like you're not supposed to watch. Something that is violent. Something that will scare the shit out of you. And that's exactly what Sam wanted to make. At the time of the reboot's premiere, cabin in the woods horror movies had become a well-worn cliche. So much so that just a year prior, Drew Goddard and Joss Whedon's The Cabin in the Woods hit theaters, taking all the tropes of Evil Dead and its imitators and using them to skewer the expectations of horror audiences. Evil Dead was also coming after a massive wave of modern horror remakes of classics, all unnecessary and largely unliked. Horror remakes have been happening for decades, but the procession of The Wicker Man, The Fog, The Omen, Pulse, Quarantine, The Hills Have Eyes, Halloween, My Bloody Valentine, Friday the 13th, The Last House on the Left, The Stepfather, and A Nightmare on Elm Street was rough, and probably best left forgotten. Although that would kind of make for a great video topic. And the Crazies remake from this time is actually pretty good. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is that remaking Evil Dead at this point in time wasn't going to be easy. But in hindsight, the movie is even better given the context. What I think the true strength of Evil Dead 2013 is that it embraces the elements of its subgenre and plays them straight. And while it's using the shape of the original to inform its approach to horror, it's telling its own story, and not just being a cheap imitation of a classic. There was never any need for an Evil Dead remake, and I think the creators knew that. So instead, what they delivered was a fresh take on the series' roots. Alvarez and Sayagua's script, which was revised by Diablo Cody to help Americanize the dialogue, is solid, giving its characters texture but not really anything of note outside its two main characters. Then again, that's the case for basically every character outside of Ash in the original films. As for the film's relationship to the rest of the series, well, it could just happen decades after the original films, with the cabin untouched and waiting for another round of victims. Ash's car is rusting away nearby, even though it was sucked into the past, and the Necronomicon is still there despite being burned up in the original. But these movies play loose with canon, relying on the idea that the evil force will always return to explain away inconsistencies. Alvarez said, "It continues the first one. The coincidences of events between the first film and mine are not coincidences, but more like dark fate created by the evil book." Of course, there are big changes to how the forces of evil work here, with this Book of the Dead revealing 3 ways to destroy a Deadite: burning, dismemberment, and burial. with some helpful tagging giving audiences the straight facts, instead of having to translate all that stodgy old Kandarian. Its opening sequence featuring the exorcism and death of a deadite daughter sets the stakes and lets audiences understand the tone the rest of the film will follow. Essentially, this opening is like a fucked up mirror to the opening of Raimi's Drag Me to Hell from 2009. And really, Drag Me to Hell is the true spiritual successor to the tone set by Evil Dead 2, using a lot of similar camera tricks and gross out gags that of course come from the Three Stooges pilled mind of Raimi. Hey, that's another great idea for a video. And as far as the idea that a director is essentially a tone manager for their film, Alvarez's approach is more somber, more likely to dwell on the grime and rot of homes and bodies. Viscera and pulp are explored in detail through visual tableaus that play like a more kinetic Wes Anderson for dang-ass freaks. I really like Fede's lingering shots. He and cinematographer Aaron Morton create a really striking composition, and then let you think on it. It's kind of the opposite of Raimi's fast-cut montage approach, and that also underlines the opposing approaches to horror. The brutality inflicted on bodies here is not played for laughs, and isn't shrugged off. It ruins victims. That makes for a less rewatchable movie, but it also terrifies in ways the movie wants. Of course, this being a reboot of Evil Dead, there are certain elements of the original that absolutely have to stay. Possession, a broken cellar door, limb removal, deadites flipping back and forth to torment loved ones. But there's also new wrinkles. The biggest being a demon called the Taker of Souls, that desires to feed on 5 people to raise something called the Abomination from Hell. This change, along with little tweaks like Burial dispelling a Kandarian demon from a body, give Evil Dead a clearer story arc, with motivations for both the Deadites and the survivors beyond the original's pure bloody chaos. The Evil Dead was the work of a group of talented people learning on the job. In the years since, each of its creators have acknowledged its shortcomings, but none are so specific and self-critical as Raimi's views on the infamous tree rape scene. Decades later, Raimi would say, "I think it was unnecessarily gratuitous and a little too brutal. And finally, because people were offended in a way that I didn't, my goal is not to offend people. It is to entertain, thrill, scare, make them laugh, but not offend them." What I find fascinating, however, is that in this new approach to the original, that scene is still essentially in here. But despite this movie being more visceral, more realistic, and generally more aggressive than the original, this scene feels much less gratuitous. I think that's because instead of being a random bit of sexual violation, it's a possession scene where the reality of what's happening is in question. Still disturbing, but more because of how Mia's torment is approached, instead of the stark, violating nature of the original. Evil Dead is playing with ideas of addiction, detoxing, and relapsing, with Mia's friends describing the massive change that comes over her during both drug use and going cold turkey. Seen through the lens of addiction, the Deadite force is the heroin Mia's addicted to, and the violation scene is her relapse, getting inside her and changing her into a different person. Like Mia, the soon-to-be possessed see a Deadite version of themselves before they're taken over, a vision of their darker halves unleashed. Mia's struggle to overcome her addiction adds interesting layers to the film, and the first half of the movie is making some effort to define the characters' relationships to one another, and the past struggles they've had around Mia's addiction. And I think having this be propelled by a group of friends wanting to save Mia is a great way to motivate our characters and give them a blindness to what's going on before it's too late. Given that Mia is suffering withdrawals, the film plays with the idea that what she's seeing could be all in her overly stressed mind. For the first act, Evil Dead toys with what's real and what's imagined, tripling down on Mia's frantic cold turkey detox to make us wonder where the movie is actually going. Of course, it's eventually proved to be the demonic work of the Deadites, and while that causes the film to explode into a shower of viscera, it also means the story loses its central metaphor and becomes more about the next gag to be put on screen, instead of how addiction can destroy an entire group of people. Of course, a movie doesn't need to be about something deeper to be great. Evil Dead 2 is one of my favorite movies of all time, and it's purely interested in taking audiences on a roller coaster ride. But I can't help but feel slightly disappointed that Alvarez's Evil Dead only vaguely gestures at its ideas of facing and overcoming addiction, which becomes harder to see through the endless waves of blood. And when you talk about Evil Dead 2013, you have to talk about its blood and guts. Alvarez and company were committed to doing practical effects, with the director saying, "There's no CGI in the movie. Everything you see is real," which was really demanding. This was a very long shoot. 70 days of shooting at night. There's a reason people use CGI. It's cheaper and faster. I hate that. We researched a lot of magic tricks and illusion tricks, like how you would make someone's arm disappear. And while I do think there's some CGI used for cleanup, the immediacy and viscerality of these practical effects make them way more intense. The second act in particular is where things get brutal, with Olivia and Natalie both possessed alongside the trapped Mia, and Eric turned into the movie's pincushion. The Deadites here aren't suddenly twisted into exaggerated ghouls, but instead mutilate themselves. And the difference turns the film into a piece of true body horror. The gore in this movie is so graphic and so real looking that I can't show some of it in this video because it'll cause YouTube to restrict its viewership. Although I have it on good authority that this is actually a movie and not a documentary. They didn't really have this woman cut off her, oh god, blur the picture. And that arm severing scene reflects what a different beast this film is, echoing Ash chainsawing off his possessed hand in Evil Dead 2. But instead of shrugging it off and becoming the coolest hero in horror history, Natalie dies from the trauma. In the theatrical cut, Deadite Natalie and Olivia just kinda disappear despite not quite getting the proper disposal needed. But a deleted scene shows David eliminating them in an Ash-like way. A strange thing to leave out. I think the production design, costuming, makeup, and effects are all top-notch. Those alone make this a worthy follow-up to the series. I'm not really a fan of most of the color grading. It's definitely in line with a lot of post-2000s horror that carried on to the early parts of the 2010s, where muddy colors and deep shadows were designed to add a layer of reality. However, the third act is such a huge level up, taking on greater stylization and urgency with David trying to rescue his sister. There's also some Raimi touches in the getting ready montage and grave digging, as the drab nature of the rest of the movie gives way, as the cabin burns and blood rains down, taking on a wild operatic tone as composer Roque Banos' score goes really big. The swerve of having Mia be your MacGuffin in the first act, main villain in the second, and hero in the third is awesome. That's a way to keep the audience guessing, and to keep your film from following the conventions of the original. And Levy is fantastic in all three modes. Having all the damage done to a body as a Deadite reversed when cured is a bit convenient, but Mia suffers more than enough with this film's take on the chainsaw hand. Also, I have a question. The abomination rises when 5 souls have been fed on, but this happens after Mia has been restored. So, how does that count? Or is a nibble enough for this to happen? Or maybe it's the girl from the opening? And after all of that, why is the abomination just another Deadite? I don't know, and I don't think the movie really knows either, but I dig it. Having Mia fight her dark side embodied in a separate Deadite is a great way to bring closure to her arc. She's quite literally fighting her addiction. And it's also a good excuse for a crazy, tense, bloody finale.
I will feast on your soul. Feast on this motherfucker!
With Mia walking away from the threat of the cabin, but the book still intact. One of 3 possible endings. One that saw her picked up by a truck driver and possibly still possessed, and another that ended like the original's Deadite Force returning. Evil Dead 2013 ends on a somewhat hopeful note, but leaves the door open for sequels, which were discussed but never happened. In fact, there are quite a few what-ifs surrounding Alvarez's movie. The director originally wanted Mia to be Ash's daughter, but Raimi shot that down, and was a concept that returned in Ash vs. Evil Dead and caused massive issues behind the scenes. There were also discussions that both Army of Darkness 2 and Evil Dead 2 would be made, leading to another film that would bring the 2 leads together. But although the film made $97.5 million on its $17 million budget, a sequel never happened despite Alvarez voicing his excitement to make one. That's likely due to fans not quite being satisfied with this departure, and still demanding Ash. And no, a 5-second post-credits stinger made for fun doesn't count. If anything, it just drove fans crazier. A decade later, 2013's Evil Dead is a complete outlier in the series, as Bruce Campbell's character returned for 3 seasons of the fun, if uneven, Ash vs. Evil Dead, which will get its own video someday. It's possible that the soon-to-release Evil Dead Rise will tie into Mia's story somehow, with the film seeming to mix the reboot's extreme gore with the original trilogy's more heightened nature. But in any case, the lack of follow-up to what was designed to be a return to the series' roots has made this a strange detour that has only grown stranger as the years go on. But I think it's also made Alvarez's film even more original. A reboot dedicated to the spirit of the film it's revisiting and not the plot details. With a dedication to practical, stomach-churning effects that haven't aged a day. Now, it stands as the truly ultimate experience in grueling terror. Thanks for watching today's video, and if you're familiar at all with the channel, you probably know by now that I'm a huge fan of Evil Dead, with Evil Dead 2 being one of my favorite movies of all time, and of course the greatest movie ever made, just barely outranking Predator and Kiki's Delivery Service. And while I'm a huge fan of the original trilogy, I have a lot of mixed opinions on the Evil Dead reboot. As I mentioned in the video, my movie-going experience seeing this reboot all those years ago, a decade now, was probably colored a bit by that 3-year-old in the same row as me, screaming and scared out of their mind. It was a little distracting. And I just didn't quite vibe with the movie at that time. But a decade later and revisiting it a few times has made me appreciate it a lot more. I don't love it in the way that I love the Evil Dead, Evil Dead 2, and Army of Darkness, but I still think that it is a solid entry in the larger franchise. Of course, I'm also releasing this video just in time for the release of Evil Dead Rise, and I'm so excited for that movie. Of course, at the time of this video coming out, I haven't seen it yet, but I will be watching it very, very soon, and I'm so pumped for more Evil Dead. I've made sure not to spoil myself about anything, but I'm hoping for something that manages to balance a fresh new direction with all the elements of this series that I love. And I'm sure whether it's in the near or distant future, I will be doing a video someday on Evil Dead Rise. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the Evil Dead reboot, the Evil Dead franchise as a whole, and Evil Dead Rise if you're watching this after the movies come out, and maybe even a ranking of all of them. And as I mentioned in the video, yes, I will one day also do an Ash vs. Evil Dead video. I have a lot to say about that series in both its highs and lows. It was a lot of fun, but it was a very mixed bag for me. But of course, it has Bruce Campbell as Ash, so I can never discount it entirely. Oh, and I'd really actually like to do those video ideas on Drag Me to Hell and the late 2000s horror remake boom. There's a lot I can say about both of those topics. As always, a huge thank you to my patrons for their continued support. And if you'd like to be a patron, it's only $1 a month for early access to every video and exclusive Patreon reviews. This month I held a poll on which classic sci-fi movie I should do a review of only for Patreon, and the winner was Akira. And that review will be only on Patreon. Until next time, I hope that you're taking care of yourselves, and maybe think twice about reading any suspicious, flesh-bound books found in cabin basements. Although I did just find this one here. Let me crack this open. Naturum de Manto. Oh, seems interesting.